Welcome back to Anatomy and Physiology, and today's submodule is the heart anatomy. Learning objectives are: compare the superficial features of the anterior and posterior aspects of the heart, name the three layers of the heart wall and the tissue components of each, characterize the four chambers of the heart and their functions, compare and contrast the structure and function of the two types of heart valves, describe the location and function of the fibrous skeleton, describe the general structure of the cardiac muscle, explain the intracellular structures of the cardiac muscle, and discuss how the cardiac muscle meets its energy needs. All right, let's go ahead and dive right in. So the heart is composed of the four chambers, which are the two atrias and two ventricles. The surface of the heart has a deep groove, termed the sulci. These grooves can serve to delineate the separation of some of the internal chambers. The anterior view of the heart, the chambers and the great vessels. You'll see that there is the right auricle, which shows a dog-eared appearing structure hanging from the external surface of the right atrium known as the right auricle. And portions of the left auricle and left ventricle are also visible from this angle. Also visible are the pulmonary trunk that splits into the right and left pulmonary arteries, and then you can also make out the ascending aorta, aortic arch, and descending aorta. On the posterior side, you will also see that same dog-ear structure that hangs from the left side of the atria called the left auricle, and the left auricle is a little bit more difficult to visualize in the anterior view due to its partially being obscured by the aortic and pulmonary trunks. There also is the clear left atrium and left ventricle when you can see the heart viewed posteriorly. The left atrium and the left ventricle are more prominent, and you can see that it forms a base of the posterior superior surface. Also visible over here in the posterior view is the pulmonary veins attached to the left atrium, the superior inferior vena cava, the pulmonary arteries, of course the pulmonary interventricular sulcus, and the coronary sulcus that houses the coronary sinus. Sulci of the heart. Coronary sulcus separates the atria from the ventricles, and the groove extends around the circumference of the heart. The interventricular sulci separate the left and right ventricles, and you have the anterior interventricular sulcus, and you also have the posterior interventricular sulcus. Keep in mind that these grooves contain coronary vessels that supply blood to the heart wall. Over here is a picture that shows you that. You can see, first of all, the right auricle over here, covering over the right atrium, the right ventricle on the bottom. You'll see the left atria and the left auricle and the left ventricle over here. Notice the aortic arch. You will also see the ascending aorta. You will see the inferior and superior vena cavas. You will see the pulmonary veins, pulmonary arteries. Over here, posterior view, you can see clearly you have the interventricular sulcus. You also have the coronary sinus, and pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins. So the layering of the heart is also interesting. Note that the walls of the ventricle are thicker than the walls of the atria, and the left ventricle is thicker than the right ventricle wall. The thickness of the heart is associated with the compression pressure of the chamber that it must exert, and thus the left ventricle exerts a lot more compression force to perfuse the systemic circulation. You'll see over here that when you do a cross-section, the left side is thicker. The heart walls is divided into three layers. We have the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. The epicardium is termed as the visceral pleura, which is composed of simple squamous epithelial tissue that overlies a small amount of areolar connective tissue. As an individual ages, the epicardium thickens and becomes a little bit more invested with adipose connective tissue. The myocardium, which is the muscle layer in the middle layer, is composed of cardiac muscle, which we'll talk about shortly. And then we also have the endocardium, which is the innermost layer composed of simple squamous epithelium, also referred to as the endothelium of the underlying areolar connective tissue. And this is continuous with the lining of the blood vessels. Over here is a picture showing you that. On the left-hand side, you can see the endocardium, a thin layer of simple squamous epithelial tissue. The middle layer is a myocardium, a cardiac muscle. And then the outer layer is simple squamous epithelium, which is composed and mixed in with areolar connective tissue, and it gets replaced with adipose tissue as you age, also known as epicardium. So let's take a look at the heart chambers. The internal anatomy of the heart is noted, and there are two atria that are internally separated by a thin wall called the interatrial septum, while the two ventricles are separated by a thicker wall known as the interventricular septum. So we'll start off with the right atria. The right atria has a smooth posterior wall, and the ridges that serve to compose a pectinate muscle located on the interior side of the right auricle. The right atrium in the adult versus that of a fetal heart has three openings: the coronary sinus opening, the vessel that drains the blood from the heart wall, and the openings from the superior and the inferior vena cava. So altogether, there's three holes. The pectinate muscles are ridges on the interior wall within the auricle, and again serve as an important for being able to push the blood down. The fossa ovalis is an oval depression inside the interatrial septum that at one time during the fetal development was a foramen ovale, a hole that shunted blood from the right to the left atria. Let's move down to the right ventricle. The right ventricle displays smooth, irregular muscle ridges known as the trabeculae carnae. The muscular projections extend from the interior surface of the right ventricle, and they are known as the papillary muscles. And there are 2 to 9 of these muscle sets. The papillary muscles are connected with round tendinous structures that compose of dense, regular connective tissue and also collagen fibers, and we call these the chordae tendineae. The chordae tendineae, also known as heartstrings, are attached to the cusps of the actual tricuspid valve. This also helps to prevent the valve from bending backwards or prolapsing into the right atria and ensures the blood to go in the one direction when it contracts and pushes the blood down to the right ventricle. Moving on, we have the internal anatomy of the left atria, which is similar in many ways to the internal anatomy of the right atria, with the exception that there is the fossa ovalis that can't be really seen in the wall of the left atria, and the opening of the pulmonary veins that can be seen in the left atria, along with the bicuspid valve instead of the tricuspid that covers over the left atria down to the left ventricle. Then going down, you will see the left ventricle, the last part of this last chamber, is similar in many ways to the internal anatomy of the right ventricle. The major differences here are the walls of the left ventricle are much thicker, and the left ventricle injects blood into the aorta, which is located on the superior end of the left ventricle and allows it to go into the systemic circuit.